that there are two major things that are of interest in James. One is, I mean, for me, I should say there are lots of other things that are of interest for other people, but one is the question of homoeroticism, which, as I've said, is marked in both his life and his work thematically. The other is the difficulty of the writing, and lots of people, if people know anything about Henry James, they know that he's a difficult writer, that often it doesn't get specified more than that, just that it's hard to know what he's talking about. And it seems to me that the particular challenges, or the fundamental argument of this book, is that the particular challenges that his writing poses are what's queer about it, much more than the thematics, much more than the biography, although these things I think are of interest. They're of interest to me sort of anecdotally and for other reasons. But the interest of James as a writer isn't in the themes, and it isn't in his biography, but rather in the specific things, challenges that he poses to forms of comprehensibility and the difficulty of his writing. As you point out, there's been a lot of controversy about homoeroticism in James's life, and that there are a series of letters published that he wrote to younger men. Various people have argued about whether these are homoerotic letters or whether that's a kind of avuncular or paternal affection that he's expressing, although the language is very kind of graphic, and it's very expressive, I guess, in kind of physically. That is, he's not referring to physical acts, but he's expressing physical desires in these letters. Although they need to be read, in other words. And the biographies have been controversial, as you say, in the assertions that it makes about his sex life. There have been a series also of novels, like Colum Toybean's is the most famous, probably, called The Master. For me, I think the question goes back to what one calls style. And one of the ways of understanding style, or I think one of our commonsensical ways of thinking about what style is as a personal stamp that someone puts on a language. That is, if you talk about someone having a writing style, one thinks of that as a personality or something that shows through in a text. I think that meaning of style is unavoidable, and it's certainly playing into what I mean by style, but it's not quite the concept that I'm working with of style in this book, which is that it seems to me that rather than thinking of style as that is, all great writers have a style. That is, you can recognize James from a sentence. If you open up one of his works, you know it's by him. The same could be said of Faulkner or of Woolf or any great stylist. You know their sentences immediately. It's not because they're particularly pure or because they're expressing, I think, for me, it's not because they're expressing something about their personality, but rather there's a particular mode of susceptibility that I think that it would be more productive to think of style not as a mastery over language, but rather as a susceptibility to it. That is a particular mode of being able to submit oneself to language. And that would mean that it is as much a kind of impersonal force as a personal one. That is, it's not a mastery that a particular person exerts over the language, but rather a way that a particular writer is mastered by language. And so that means that the work doesn't express the psychological particularities of a writer, but rather the writer, because of whatever psychological peculiarities or particularities, has a particular form of potentiality or susceptibility to what language can do. And I think James is an excellent case of that. There are other aspects of his writing, I think, that sort of challenge understanding him in terms of representations of psychology. And that's the slightly different question, but it's related. That this is the question of to what extent does literature represent psychology, either of characters or of their authors. And this goes to the question of the extent to which a writer's corpus expresses a biography. And so it's a very large question of how one reads James as and his writing as expressing a particular person's life, or on the contrary, is the life a kind of residue of the work? One of the arguments of the book is that if what I'm calling the queerness of style has a thematic marker in James's text, it's belatedness. And it's belatedness is a concept that's insofar as James has themes. I mean, I think one of the striking things about James's work is the thinness of the plots. That is, very little happens in James. But to the extent that things do happen, over and over again, one encounters characters who arrive at their experience either too early or too late. In the late fiction, it's often too late. Although I would pair this with some of the earlier fiction, or the moment when the so-called late style, starts to form, is when James becomes interested in children. I mean, he's interested in children throughout his work, but so there are a series of characters who are sort of too early for their experience, and then there are a series of characters who are too late. And this thematic preoccupation of James, the classic example is Lambert Strether in The Ambassadors, who goes to Paris and discovers, in effect, that he hasn't lived, and it's too late for his life, and he sort of falls in love with this young man, and partly by way of imagining what his life could have been like. So this thematic preoccupation of James has been of interest to critics who are concerned with the relation of his biography to the works, partially because they see these figures as ciphers for James's own psychological existence. That is, and in particular, his homoerotic desire, like that he discovered his desire for men too late to act on it. I would argue instead that what belatedness marks is the submission of the life to style. I mean, so I think I might make the connection between belatedness and homosexual thematics in a slightly different way. That is, that it seems to me that queer people have access to or have the opportunity to access a fundamental asynchronicity of life, which is also there in straight lives, although they perhaps don't have to confront it for various reasons. That is, that heterosexual life can understand itself in relation to patterns of replicating sociality. That is, one's parents are heterosexuals, one is heterosexual, one has children. That is, one can understand one's life in relation to an unfolding of a history. Whereas for any gay person, there's this moment of coming out, which involves a fundamental break between what one was and what one has become. And this break means that in a sense, it always occurs too late. I mean, this occurred to me a few years ago when a student was talking to me about how anxious he was because he had only come out in his junior year of high school, and so he had missed the opportunity of being gay as a freshman and a sophomore. And so to me, this sounded completely absurd because of the generational difference. That is, that lots of people didn't come out until they were 25 or 30 or 35 or whatever. So the idea that you would miss a year of being gay at age 15 seems sort of moving in a way, that this is what you would be sad about. But it also raised the question for me of the degree to which the act of coming out itself produces the sense of being too late. That is, it's not actually a chronological question. That is, if you come out when you're 60 or if you come out when you're 15, you're always too late for your sexuality, insofar as the coming out produces a before that is inauthentic in relation to the sexuality that's revealed. So that's to say that coming out produces experiences of belatedness that also have to do with the fact that human cognition takes place in time. I mean, that is that one is always too late for one's thoughts. That is, that they by the time you've formulated them, they've passed. And so the relation between, say, writing and thought, writing and life, is always belated in the same way that the act of coming out makes one belated, insofar as it produces the thing that it is after. And so it seems to me that there are various ways to think about the way that. Therefore, I would also say that. Because belatedness is an index of style in James, the affect that's associated with it isn't sadness. I mean, the sense that one gets when one reads about belatedness in James and other critics is one of sadness or patheticness. That is, he realized that he was gay when he was too old to act on it. It was very sad, and the affect of James's fiction actually isn't melancholic or sad. It's joyful. That is, it's partially because there are few writers for whom one could say, as with James, that experience makes everything possible. That is, he's a writer of possibility, and you see this in the autobiographies. He talks about various forms of sort of strange educational experiments that his father did, where he kept putting him in different schools, taking him out of schools, making him an apprentice. Nothing lasted for very long, and his brother, William James, regretted this. He said that he regretted that there was no method to this mode of education. And James, on the contrary, says that you can't regret your own experience. That because your experience makes you who you are, you fundamentally can't regret it, because it makes possible everything that you can do. And so thinking, in some sense, it doesn't make sense to think about how things might have been otherwise, because you wouldn't be the person you are if things had been otherwise. And so he also that autobiography is a great pleasure to read, among other things, because it's about the infinite possibilities of experience. That is, experience becomes art, sort of, no matter what you do. One of the difficulties in writing about James is that there's no definitive text. He wrote, in addition to writing an immense amount, he, among other things, he wrote so many letters that the people who are editing his letters now think they probably won't finish editing them before they're in their own lifetimes. That is, there's just so much there, and wrote so many novels and stories and essays, and so he's constantly writing. But in addition, he was also constantly revising what he wrote, so that many of the novels, for instance, appear in serial forms, and they appear in multiple book forms. And then at the end of his life, he undertook a project called the New York edition, where he revised a selection of his works, did a very major revision of them, so that they're quite different. Some of the early texts that are republished in the New York edition, and he's quite interested in revision. That is, he can't, and says at moments that he to read something is to revise it. That is, whenever he reads his own work, he rewrites it. And I think that one way to think about that would be in relation to belatedness. That is, that one's he thrives on making the writing sort of out of sync with itself. That is, on making the text not coincide. There's no finished product. It's constantly in the mode of being rewritten, and that's another marker, I think, of belatedness, and I think ultimately of the queerness of style in James's work. As I said before, lots of people talk about James's difficulty. And it seems to me that it's worth dwelling on what that means. I mean, when students say that it's difficult, they tend to mean something like wordy, or what they say is wordy, which seems to mean that there's the relation between form and content is sort of out of whack somehow, or that the verbal complexity is out of proportion to the thematic concerns. And so one of the things that the book tries to do is to specify some of the things that are difficult in James, and I think that it has to, and this occurs on a various kinds of levels. So on the one hand, the syntax is very difficult. There are peculiarities of pronoun reference. There are particularities of sentence structure. One of the ones that I talk about a lot in a chapter on the wings of the dove is something that the grammarian Otto Jespersen calls extraposition. So these strange Gallicisms in the first sentence of the wings of the dove is she waited Kate Croy for her father. That is, so that the doubling of the subject and is strictly speaking unnecessary. So one of the things that chapter talks about is what that's doing in relation to the concerns of the text. There are also sort of difficulties of voice and tone, that is, of knowing where the narrator is in relation to what is being said in a text. And this can be thought about in all sorts of different ways. A free and direct style is one of the ways of thinking about that. But there's also, to go back to the question of the relation between form and content, there's also a sense that the syntactical or stylistic complexity of the text is motivating the writing rather than the other way around. So, for instance, one of the rhetorical figures that I talk about in the book is a rhetorical figure called solipsis or zoigma, which is it's a collocation of unlike terms or incommensurate terms. So a famous one is Alanis Morissette. He held his breath and the door for me. So that is, you're collocating breath and door, that they both can be governed by the same verb held, but they're being used in different ways. So this is a rhetorical figure that fascinates James, and you see it a lot in his work. It can also refer to using combining literal and figurative register simultaneously. So there's an instance in The Golden Bowl where a character named Fanny Assingham wraps herself in her thoughts still more than in her lemon-colored mantle. So the fact that you could wrap yourself in your thoughts as you do in a cloak or something. So the other famous example is from Pope. She stained her honor in her new brocade. That is, that you'd stain things in two different ways. So this becomes for me a figure of the way that James is. That is, if one thinks of the style motivating the themes. So for instance, in The Golden Bowl, it's a novel about adultery and marriage. It seems to me that rather than thinking of solipsis as a figure for adultery, one might think of adultery as a figure for solipsis. That is, that in some sense the novels are structured by these syntactical or stylistic experiments. And insofar as that inversion takes place, I think that one could call this is what I'm calling the queerness of style. Partly that the inversion of the relation between theme and between form and content, or between style and what it conveys, is much more than any particular sexual desire that's thematized what makes the style queer. I think I do think that there's something specific about James. I mean, that there's something about the style that's worth holding on to in specific terms. On the other hand, it does seem to me that that the kinds of concerns that I'm bringing up in the text would be of interest for queer reading in general. And it seems to me very important, actually, to assert that. I think that one of the things that queer literary criticism has done is to focus on writers whose works express homosexual desire, or the biography or whose writers are marked by homoerotic attachments. And I think that for various theoretical reasons, or for various kinds of reasons, it's important for that for writers or for critics to think about writers who aren't obvious. Faulkner would be a good example, and it's someone who I'm writing about right now. Someone who, as far as I know, there aren't I don't know of anything homoerotic in his biography. It's once you start reading him, it's sort of shocking that no one has noticed how homoerotic the fiction actually is. But it seems to me that it's important to think about, for queer criticism, to be able to address writers who aren't explicitly marked as, for various reasons. One of them is that it seems to me that it's important to assert that queer criticism isn't simply claiming writers for a project of, asserting that particular people are gay, that it is a project of reading and of criticism that doesn't simply identify the members of the club, right? I think it's also a matter of asking what is queer criticism, what can queer criticism do, like and it seems to me that it's slightly impoverished if one thinks of it as merely identifying homosexual desire. Although I think that in any kind of homophobic climate, it's important to do that. I mean, it's important just to make manifest that homoerotic desire is there, insofar as homophobia tends to ignore it, or our culture tends to ignore it when it's sitting there looking at them. So that's to say that merely to identify homoerotic thematics or homoerotic biographies has a salutary effect in some sense. But that I think that queer criticism can do a lot more, and it can do a lot more to read the specificity of the writers that of nearly any writer, I would think. I think there is one chapter, the final chapter of the book, does come closest. It's the chapter on the ambassadors, comes closest to outlining or to addressing sort of gay themes in a book. That is, insofar as the ambassadors sort of obliquely does tell a kind of love story, or a man who falls in love with another man. So there have been people who've expressed a kind of relief when they get to that, because finally this book that's supposed to be about the queerness of style has someone gay in it. The chapter before that, also it may be my favorite chapter, and I suspect it will be the least read in the book, because it's on sort of non-canonical. It's not on one of the major novels, but it's on the wartime writings, and also the autobiography on A Small Boy and Others, and Notes of a Son and Brother, and in that chapter there is a kind of discussion of James's own biographical. Although again, it would probably be frustrating for some people, because it doesn't simply unveil the homoerotic attachments in his biography, but talks about, among other things, his relationship to Rupert Brooke, and his sort of playful, what he does with the death of a poet, and so that his writing on Rupert Brooke and his writing on Shakespeare's The Tempest, and also his autobiography, are ways of James's own reflections on the relation of biography to life, and so therefore, in a sense, also the relation of desire to its expression in literature. I think another reason to think about that is another common way of thinking about how desire enters into a text is by way of sublimation or repression. That is, and I think this is a common way of thinking about James, but of lots of other sort of queer writers. That is, instead of having sex, they wrote things, and I think that's. I mean, it's a mode of thinking that ultimately has its source in Freud. This is the argument of his book on Leonardo. But I want to be clear that when I talk about the queerness of style, or how the homoerotic desire enters into the text, that I'm not talking about a model of sublimation or of substitution, right? That the style is queer, and that in some sense to write is to submit oneself to the queerness of language, rather than to substitute for. So that is that one could be a queer writer if one had lots of gay sex. One could be a queer writer if one had none. That in other words, that the relationship between the sex that one has in life and the writing is not linear or determined. It's hard to talk about one's own innovativeness without sounding fatuous. And it seems to me that the book does have its roots in a series of different kinds of critical work on James. I mean, so on the one hand, critics have made the homoerotic thematics and the homoerotic traces in the biography sort of ineffaceable, and I think this has been very important work insofar as there was a kind of what Eve Sedgwick called active incuriosity about homosexuality in James for various reasons, partly to protect his reputation when it was kind of under threat, partly for homophobic reasons, partly because people weren't interested in it. So there are a whole series of critics who brought out homosexuality and homosexual themes in James, and I think this is a very important work, without which the writing in my book would not have been possible. There's also another series of critics who have explored the stylistic and other kinds of complexities in James, who have brought out that the complexity of his relation to realism, for example, or the complexity of his representations of psychology. So that there's very important work that shows that whereas James is traditionally read as kind of the culmination of a tradition of the psychological novel, that if one looks carefully at how psychology is represented in the text, it's actually very baffling. There's a great book by Sharon Cameron that points out that thinking in Henry James, which is the title of her book, weirdly occurs between people and outside of people's heads, in a sense. And this goes along with another aspect that the people have pointed out, which is that this writer who's supposed to represent people's psychology in this infinitely precise way makes everyone talk alike. That is, that there's a kind of leveling of psychologies in his text. So this is sort of a long way around to say that what Henry James and the Queerness of Style argues is that these two kind of separate traditions, which largely haven't interacted, that is, the critics who are interested in spelling out some of the complexities of his writing and his style, and critics who are interested in homosexuality in his text, that these are really the same. So I think that the innovation of the book is twofold. I mean, or at least two things come to mind. One is in bringing these two strands of the criticism together. That is to say that I guess like any kind of innovation, it involves seeing what was already there and what other people were doing. I think the other innovation could look slightly old-fashioned, which is that I see the book as a kind of return to close reading. Which is something that we used to do, or what literary criticism used to be all about. And for various reasons in the 80s and the 90s, we've moved away from close reading, or it's come under suspicion as being for various reasons. And there are still kind of movements, I think. There are ways in which literary criticism is moving away from it. It's a different kind of close reading, I think, than what we used to do. In the sense, in some ways, that it's closer. I think it's a more kind of obsessively close style of reading. So I think that's one of the challenges of the book, is that it gets very immersed in very particular aspects of particular sentences, and so I think that if there's an innovation in terms of its method, it would have to do with thinking about how one can bring close reading into contact with a kind of political criticism, which by and large has been thematic or historical. And so that is, if one can do a kind of formal analysis of a text that's also in touch with questions of homosexuality, sexuality, and sexual politics, and I think that one could just as well do this kind of analysis in relation to race or gender or class or some of the other kind of too crude ways we have of conceiving of human identity, that this would be something for me that would be exciting about the possibilities that it spells out for literary criticism.